A man who has had more juice in his system than a Walmart and Costco combined, originated and popularized ground and pound, became the first heavyweight champion of the UFC. Oh, and most importantly, got his back taken by Joe Rogan. But to be fair, that's kind of unfair since Joe is on the juice and Mark is such a natty person, right? Anyways, if you haven't already guessed, well, I mean, you probably have seen the title if you have two sets of eyes and a set of brains. Set of brains? I don't know about that. Anyways, if you haven't already guessed, today we'll be taking a deep dive into the career of Mark Coleman and discussing who he really is. And Mark, if you're watching this, please don't come after me. One right hand to the dome from you, and I'll wind up with more CTE than Diego Sanchez. Mark Daniel Coleman was born December 20th, 1964. He was a big baby to say the least. However, with a frame like that, he was destined to become an MMA and wrestling legend. Mark was born in a small town in Ohio called Fremont. And at the age of only 5, he already had his sights set on becoming an Olympic champion, NFL player, and MLB player. But like many of us who shared similar dreams, they obviously didn't come true. However, the difference with Mark was that he actually came extremely close to achieving one of those. Growing up, Mark was shy and would sometimes get picked on by the older kids. Nothing too serious, but definitely enough to add some fuel into Mark's fire. This, paired with his previous dreams of becoming a world champion in something, would begin his journey into the world of athletics. Mark even remembers by the age of 5 being able to complete 100 consecutive push-ups. He remembers this because his uncle would give him 1 penny for each consecutive push-up he would do. Mark would push through the pain and at 5 years old would collect his dollar after doing 100 push-ups. However, he also remembers that this dollar would often go missing in his house. You see, his parents were definitely on the poorer side and needed all the help they can get. Looking back on it, Mark thinks that while he was sleeping, his parents went into his room, took the dollar, and used it to pay for water, food, bills, and whatever the house needed. He definitely doesn't hold a grudge over them for this, and he credits everything to his parents today. Mark would continue to follow his dreams of becoming a world champion throughout high school. He played some football, baseball, wrestling, but mostly focused on ping pong actually. In only his second year of high school, he became a state champion and dethroned the long-time reigning champion, Forrest Gump. Okay, maybe that's a lie, and Mark was actually a state wrestling champion in his second year. However, this achievement, as great as it was, didn't satisfy Mark. So what did he do? He kept grinding and juicing, grinding and juicing, grinding and juicing. Well, okay, maybe not the second part just yet. But yeah, in his sophomore year, Mark would place second in his state, and in his senior year would win his second state championships. Now, with 2 state championships under his belt, and a goal of pounding men in the future, read that wrong. Ground and pounding men in the future, Mark would commit to the University of Miami. Here, Mark would become a 2-time Mid-American champion and would earn his first honors as an All-American. Then, in his senior year, he would transfer to Ohio State University, where he would win his first and only NCAA championship. This would mark the beginning of Mark's run at his dreams. It was his opportunity to achieve everything he wanted as a child. He had won back-to-back Pan Am championships, won gold at the Pan American Games, and placed second at the World Championships. However, this would all prove to be meaningless in comparison to what it would mean to win gold at the Olympics. And in 1992, Mark would get the closest he ever would to achieving his childhood dreams of doing so. He placed 7th at these Olympics and was definitely not satisfied with the outcome, to say the least. He would go on to say this about the experience.
Sucker punched 3 times out there. I got him down. Ninja and fucking Silva, they both suckered my ass. But I had good. Can't hurt you. Cheap motherfuckers. Cheap motherfuckers.
Either way, it would be after this loss where Mark would sit down with all of his wrestling buddies and watch 2 girls, sorry, wrong script, here we go. He would watch UFC 1 with all of his buddies. And after watching the event, he would look them all in the eyes and say, "That's my belt and that's my money." A seed had been planted. Mark felt just like his 5-year-old self when he was dreaming of becoming a world champion. And although as much as Mark wanted to get into the organization, the UFC, he simply didn't know how. It wouldn't be until a disappointing showing at the 1996 Summer Olympics when Mark would finally get the call. He got the call that in only 30 days, he could have the opportunity to fight in an 8-man tournament for the UFC. Mark, without consulting anybody or negotiating at all, accepted that offer in hopes of achieving his dreams. Like I mentioned, Mark would accept the contract and would make his debut at UFC 10. There, in the tournament-style card, Mark would finish all 3 of his opponents in one night to become the champion. I mean, there was no heavyweight champion in the traditional sense that we see today, but he was a champion, okay? Everyone looked at him as though, and he was the star of the UFC. Anyways, before we go any further, I want to offer you or show you or bring to attention 3 things that kind of begun here during the tournament for Mark. To begin, this was the birthplace of the roid hold, a submission that Mark would go on to use many times in the future in his career. His use of the headbutts would also get originated here. From the ground position on top, Mark would just rain his head on top of his opponents. And thirdly, the fact that his second opponent in the tournament legitimately tapped out due to exhaustion. Sounds crazy, but our boy Mark would definitely learn about that in the near future. Only 2 months after winning the tournament at UFC 10, Mark was scheduled to participate in another 8-man tournament at UFC 11. There, Mark would continue to smash people, ground and pound them, put them in submissions, headbutt them, and finish them. He would finish his first 2 opponents in less than 3 minutes combined. However, once he got to the finals of the tournament, Mark was met by nobody. Scott Frizella, the man he was supposed to meet in the finals, was actually too exhausted to continue. And any other substitutes or alternatives that the UFC could have to offer were also too injured or too exhausted to continue at that matter, making Mark the winner by default. Bunch of newbies if you ask me, to be honest. They should have taken a page out of Mark's book and taken a whole lot more juice.
Looks like he's a weak-ass bitch. Shit, I should have been in that first one when I was the Grand Prix champion. We had a little more steam and a little more juice.
Anyways, after these first 2 tournaments, Mark was definitely a star. Easily one of the biggest in the UFC, and was going to fight Dan the Predator Severn for the first ever UFC heavyweight championship belt. In the fight, Mark did what Mark does. He took Dan down, ground and pounded him, headbutted him, tried submitting him, and just gassed out. But Big John had seen enough. He called the fight off, making Mark Coleman the first ever UFC heavyweight champion. But before we go any further, Julian Sanchez, the man that Mark fought in the second tournament at UFC 11, I'm calling you out, buddy. What were you thinking? Making your first and only fight in your MMA career against Mark Coleman? I mean, come on, it didn't even look like you belonged in there. Nobody was going to warn this guy that Mark Coleman was juiced to the absolute gills and was going to smash your teeth in? Like, come on, did nobody care about this guy? This poor, poor man. Julian, if you're watching this, My heart goes out to you, man, really. Anyways, back to Mark. This would begin a bit of a rough patch in the career of Mark Coleman. You see, only 2 months after defeating Dan for the first ever UFC Heavyweight Championship, Mark was scheduled to fight Maurice Green in his first title defense. However, Mark was too busy. He was too busy celebrating achieving his childhood dreams of becoming a world championship. What did this mean? It meant that Dan would spend his entire 2-month training camp just celebrating. No training and just partying. But Frank Shamrock, Maurice's coach, did warn Mark about this. He saw the partying Mark was doing and told him to get in the gym and start training. But come on, was this guy going to be listening to anybody? No, probably not. And boy did it show. By about the 6-minute mark, Mark was gassed out badly. I mean, he was practically rendered a statue for the entire rest of the fight, and Maurice would just begin chopping those legs down. He would go on to lose this fight and lose the title, and go on a bit of a losing streak to on to that. However, I did want to point out that up until this point, Mark basically didn't even have a camp with him. He would train with some boys in his local gym, but would want to stay close to his girls the entire time, so he didn't want to move over to Pat Miletich or any other gyms that were offering to join. After his career in the UFC, Mark would go on to join Pride, where memes like this were born. However, he had a bit of an interesting start to his Pride career, to say the least. He would actually lose his first bout. However, his manager would later go on to say that he was paid to throw this bout. And as competitive as Mark Coleman was, money talks. He had 2 kids and definitely needed a paycheck. However, whether you believe this or not, Mark would then go on to pick up a few wins and would then enter the infamous Pride Heavyweight Grand Prix. There, he was definitely an underdog, with Mark Kerr being the favorite amongst all 8 people. However, Mark Coleman at that didn't care whether he was the favorite, underdog, or some bum off the street. He was there to smash people, and that's exactly what he would do. He finished everybody on his path to winning that Grand Prix and becoming the champion of Pride. Honestly, an achievement so great that couldn't be matched by any other MMA organization at the time. Honestly, he was the king of the world. After this, Mark would never quite reach the same heights again. He would beat Dan Severn, get triangled by Big Nog, and of course armbarred by none other than Fedor Emelianenko himself. And to be honest, for a competitor and someone with the amount of juice in his system as Mark Coleman, he took the loss about as graciously as somebody could, with both of his daughters in the octagon with him. I mean, come on, take a look at the sweetheart yourself. Oh, I wish I could have fought longer. What a blast that was. I'll get him next time, I guess. His last 2 notable wins, well, like really significant ones at that, were against Shogun and Stefan Bonner. And I really want to show you guys how gracious Mark was in victory against Shogun, since we saw exactly his character and how humble he was in defeat against Fedor. Take a look once again. So yeah, to recap, Mark was an amazing wrestler who achieved many things in the sport and really pioneered ground and pound for people in MMA today. He achieved his dreams of becoming a world champion and did a whole lot of juice along the way. But in all honesty, I really don't fault the guy. I mean, come on, let's be honest, everybody was doing it. Well, everyone for Julian Sanchez, apparently. I mean, come on, that guy was definitely taking advantage of the wrong kind of juice, if you know what I mean. Okay, honestly, all jokes aside, Mark had an amazing career and is definitely a legend of the sport. So yeah, that's all. Mark Coleman, ladies and gentlemen. Adios.